All right, I'm here with Wayne to talk about. Wow, there's a lot to talk about, Wayne. But first, how are you?
I'm good, thank you. I had a nice weekend.
Good.
It was warm last week in Manchester. It is now rainy and grey, so the status quo has returned, thankfully. You
Very
wouldn't
good.
believe it, in my office, the time of this recording is 4 p.m. I've had to close the curtains and turn the inside light on, so it actually looks a bit brighter than it actually is. Crazy times, but it's just another
Wow.
Manchester summer.
Yeah. Well, you've got to be careful of those rays, Wayne, especially with your lack of you know,
I no, I'm always
protection.
careful. I've got all my creams are there. How are you, Eddie? How are you doing?
Oh, I'm very good. Yeah, I, I, I did some house stuff at the weekend. It's very exciting. I painted two
Yeah,
wheels on my car, and I'll do the other two this week at some point. Yeah,
yeah.
top
Did
stuff.
you do that whilst watching Gareth Southgate's England, or
No, I did some painting while watching. Which games was I watching? Not the other game. The Southgate's England. I went to the pub for the one English
oh,
pub in Seattle to stand around with mostly English fans. Unsurprisingly,
yeah,
unlike those English fans, I did stay till the end. The English fans walking out. The one I particularly like, which has obviously gone extremely viral, is a couple of gammons. I mean, they really define the word gammon. Bright, absolutely bright red. I don't know what they were doing, but this is what made me think of being careful in the sun. Absolutely purple, basically. Walking out going,
yeah,
Gareth Southgate, shite! Like this. By the way, England have
yeah.
just scored. Oh, no. It's great. Uh, England,
Yeah. There's another.
go ahead.
Sorry, go. No, I was going to talk about the other one that shows the fans coming out, and then when the roar of the goal, they all try. Well, they
All
try
try
to
and
run
rush
back in. I
back
don't
in.
know if they're
Yeah.
not successful. I'd love to know the end of that story. But there was one fan who stops and he starts chanting "England, England" like he's celebrating the goal from outside, which is just like you just turned your back. You literally just turned your back on your country, young man, and
I
you
know.
are outside. But it was great content.
And what have they got to do that's better? Like they're in the Gelsenkirchen. It's a tram ride into the centre of town and all of that. So what have they got? And they've flown out to Germany, presumably, and got
Yeah,
a hotel and everything, especially to go to this game. What have they got to do that's better than being at the game to the end? I mean, I don't understand it, but I semi understand it at Old Trafford because it's a nightmare getting out if you're in the car park,
yeah,
even if you're the third car from the entrance. That's a good hour's wait. And
yeah,
obviously, there's no train from Old Trafford anymore, so there's buses into town are mega packed, or you walk, or whatever it is, right? Or the tram. In which you can get squeezed to an inch of your life. So I kind of sort of understand Old Trafford people want to leave a bit early because it is the difference between half an hour to get home and 2 hours or whatever. But you go to the
yeah.
tournament, makes no sense to me. The other viral clip I quite enjoyed was live reporting on ITV, in which the reporter is talking to a couple
Oh,
who
yeah,
are a few sheets to the
so good.
wind, I would say, and they're going like, "He's gone now. He's definitely gone. He's definitely gone." And obviously Bellingham scores with that incredible overhead kick. I mean, like in one sense, I seem to have got myself into a discussion with Barney Rone at the Guardian, arguing about Southgate here because my general take on Southgate is he's it's that old Napoleon quote about having a wanting to have a lucky general rather than a good general. I think Southgate's a lucky general. He's come into this England side when there's more talent than there's ever been. The academy system has produced an incredible depth of English talent. You know, to the point where there's issues around certain positions, but like England player number 20 to England player number 50 are pretty identical. You know, you could have picked all sorts of squads and it be basically the same quality. And then he's got incredibly lucky with draws. And yeah, I know that's all really revisionist because England have to beat who's in front of them, but they lose the first good team they play, basically. And so I'm like, It was terrible. 2016 and the few tournaments before it, and there were times when England didn't qualify during my lifetime, didn't qualify for tournaments. Really, really terrible. But then there's, the academy system and blueprint, Howard Wilkinson's blueprint has come to this point where it's producing all this talent, and I kind of semi-feel it's been a bit wasted, which sounds ridiculous when you make a semi-final, a final, a quarter-final of tournaments, and that's, actually above England's historic perspective. Yeah. So I find it maddening watching England, even though I'm not an England fan per se, and like this lot of way less than the sum of the parts.
Yeah, no, I think that's fair, and I also think on balance, it's difficult to argue against the results because, all right, you could say that they should have won a major tournament. They were unlucky in the last Euros because it went down to penalties.
Yeah,
in the final.
Yeah,
it was on penalties, wasn't it? The Euros final. There was all the
Marcus Rashford and Jadon Sancho missed penalties.
Yeah. Okay. So there was that. So you've got the toss of a coin with that. I mean, if you get to that stage, it's not about being the best team or not being the best team because you missed the penalties. So, but records historically, like Manchester United winning the European Cup, it's there. They won 3, and thankfully, that season they probably were the best team in Europe. You couldn't really argue with that. But the World Cup performances, you feel like there was something a little bit there. If they'd been, I think the key always seems to be if you've been a little bit braver every single time. And everyone wondered if that was going to be the case with Southgate. I've had this conversation probably on this podcast, but definitely elsewhere, where I talked about his reluctance to put Cobby in, that he would, you knew that he wouldn't put him in from the start, but he would definitely be relying on him by the end of it.
Yeah, you said it here.
So it's played out that way, and that's not. I mean, that's just. It's a case of how you get there. I mean, 98. The comparison I used was Hoddle with Beckham. 98. There was no middleman. It was Anderton to Beckham, whereas there are middlemen. Obviously Gallagher was one, and Alexander Arnold for a second. He wanted to play him in midfield, so it took a longer time to get to Mainu. But obviously, I think he was one of the few brightest spots in yesterday's match. The issue that I've got with this current England, first of all, is that it is. A few people forget that it is a transitional squad from the last couple because there's a lot of new faces in the first tournament for this one. But
loads, yeah.
But still, there's still the argument that first team is stronger than anything we've ever had, particularly the midfield. And the midfield we've got Cobby, you've got Bellingham, you've got Rice, you've got Foden. England are as blessed in that department as they've been in our lifetimes. And apart from singular figures like Robson, obviously, but as a unit, they've got a great blend. It shouldn't be rocket science to figure out how to get a blend of all those players working together. And most significantly of all, that combination of players should have had some kind of control over the games that they've played against the opponents that they've faced. But have they ever looked like they've controlled the game? I can't say that. They don't look like that midfield has gone like, all right, we can shine now. Bellingham can shine. Rice can shine. Mainu has looked good individually, but not really. The midfield as a unit hasn't really shone. It hasn't done what you think it should have done, or I think it should have done. So, and that's obviously a massive impact on the performance, right? Because I mean, then if they're not providing the platform for Foden and Saka, I mean, Saka's had a miserable time. He really, really struggled. He had one moment where he got beyond one of the fullbacks yesterday, but Foden, I think I've seen people saying that Foden's playing well in the moment. I think this is not the same player. The two issues I've got, Ed, and I'll just close with this, is that my worry with England, not that I'm massively invested because I'm still from our generation of United over England, so I won't cry any tears if they lose. I'll be disappointed because I want Cobby and Shaw to pick up not even a participation. It's not even a participation medal, is it, at this point? But he's there. He's there. So my issue is not I'm not that invested in it, but I look at it and I think everything with England, their problems come to roost, and they seem most evident when the players start playing hero ball. And we saw it in the past with Gerrard was a big, and even Beckham to some extent, but Gerrard was the biggest culprit of all. And Alexander-Arnold and Foden have shown worrying bits of that. And I think I'm not saying to not play them, but I think like when things are going wrong, and those two start trying the hero ball, you know that things are running away from you. Thankfully, we didn't have that at the end yesterday.
But I think it's a symptom, not a cause. It's a symptom of the system not working. The squad was the wrong squad, right? So Southgate has built this kind of reactionary football. Now, it's not quite Ollie ball, and I think I've made that comparison before. And Carl Anker, friend of the show, has talked to me around on that one. I think he's right. The two systems are a bit different, but it's basically reactionary football. And they don't look to control things. And they've been at their best when they've had speedy wide players like Marcus Rashford or Sterling who have supported Kane. And now he's gone completely different direction. He's built a squad or picked a squad for possession-based football. And then I think he shit the beds at the very last minute and he's kind of panicked and gone, oh, hang on a minute. Like we haven't actually built a playing style that's possession-based, even though we've got all these players. So you've got Kane, Bellingham, and Foden, and Saka to some extent, because he wants to cut inside at all occupying the same zone. Yeah, all of them. Yeah. Kane drops deep. Bellingham's at number 10 when he probably, if you were brave, would have played 8, which is where he'll play for Real Madrid next season, by the way. And Foden cuts inside to that half space as well. And it's a system problem. And then they've got nobody who can play into space, right? So the ball has to go into feet all the time. It's really ponderous. So, and then the other issue is Rice can't play out in the half turn. I mean, it's been said before. He's much better if he's facing the right way when he gets the ball, which is why it should look better with Kobbie Mainoo in there. Rice just has to play a 10-yard ball to Kobbie Mainoo, take it off the centre-backs, play to Kobbie Mainoo. Kobbie Mainoo will play the quick one-touch, two-touch football into the attacking players, and England will be able to build up, right? And obviously it's massively impacted as well, last thought, by Luke Shaw not being fit. Just massively impacted because that idea that everyone is like England can't build up, and then when they can build up, everyone's clustered into the same zone would be very, very different if you had an attacking fullback on the left who'd create space and overloads and occupy some defenders. So I actually think it's quite an easy problem to fix. I mean, if Shaw's fit, great. Unfortunately, it looks like he's not. Or maybe fortunately for United, because if he plays, he's going to break himself, clearly. But I think the rest of the problem is quite easy to fix, and Southgate hasn't clocked it yet. And, obviously he knows way more about football than me. I'm just some dude who talks about football on the internet. I'm not actually a qualified coach or anything like that. So take it with a pinch of salt. I'm always obviously talking nonsense here, but it just seems very obvious that these are some problems that could be fixed. They've got a week, but Southgate has always been reluctant to make the really bold decisions. He's picked more attacking players when in the past we'd like, oh God, he's playing such a defensive team, but they're playing the same way, right? So I don't think there's any change in England's style, despite there being lots more attacking players. So he's got a week to fix it, but I'd be really surprised if he does. I think he'll basically pick the same side. If he was really bold, I think he'd play someone a bit more attacking on the left. I mean, attacking, like not cutting inside, playing a bit wider. It's probably Anthony Gordon for Foden. And, this is mad, isn't it? Because Foden is English Player of the Year. You got Bellingham, Spanish Player of the Year. You got Kane, Bundesliga top scorer. You've got Saka, absolute brilliant season, brilliant player. Whisper it quietly because he's Gooner, but, fantastic player. That should be a much better attacking team than it is. And in fact, it's less than some of the parts. And I think that's all on Southgate, despite his successes from 2018 till now. All right, shall we talk about some real football, not England? That's 14 minutes on England.
Oh. One second.
One
second on England. Right. Just to say, because we can't. I mean, we talked about everything, viral videos, Southgate's things, and all that. Which I agree with all the points you've just made there. We've got to have a second because an England player scored an overhead kick, in a knockout round, which to save us in the 95th, 96th minute, which I think is spectacular enough to warrant some kind of comment. And look, like I said, I don't have any real investment, but I did really cheer that yesterday, and I feel like he was fairly average throughout the game, and he's had a difficult tournament, Bellingham, because you can see the weight of expectation on him. But that was a moment. That was a real moment.
Oh, yeah.
Well, and beautifully executed. Just great to watch.
He said afterwards that it won't mean anything unless England win the tournament. I think that's probably right? It's a fantastic moment, fantastic goal. England fans will remember that, but it'll be kind of meaningless if England lose to Switzerland, which they will do unless Southgate changes it around. But yes, unbelievable moment. I did enjoy him running away, going, who else? Kind of like those clutch players who are arrogant enough to just kind of realise it. We'd love that at United, wouldn't we? So, we'd love him at United as well. Missed that one out. Thank you, Ed Woodward. All right. So much going on at United at the moment. So we're going to talk about a few things. We're going to talk about some of the coaching changes and Dan Ashworth coming in to sort of complete the overhaul of the structure that Ineos had promised. Talk about the women's team, where it's kind of the exact opposite of structure and order. Unfortunately, talk about some transfer news because there's stuff going on, and some of the PSR jiggery pokery that's going on around the Premier League at the moment, which is kind of amusing. All right, should we get on to coaching changes? I did try and record a daily on Thursday or Friday to talk about this, and we had a tech fail with Isabel, so we can talk about it all again. Ruud van Nistelrooy, don't think he's signed on the dotted line just yet, but it's expected that he'll join. Former United striker, former PSV coach. Unclear exactly what role he's going to come into, but he'll be joining the team. I find it, just from a fan service point of view, extremely exciting. What a player. And then Rene Hake, he rolls his R's, and there's a big A at the end. Coming in, he's the who's the coach of? Completely forgotten. Go ahead, Eagles. Go ahead, Eagles. Mid-table Dutch team. Very, very long coaching career. Sometimes as first team manager, sometimes as assistant. I think he can slot into an assistant's role. So what are your initial impressions of these coaching changes?
Well, from what I understand, Benny McCarthy's leaving, right? So, so Van Nistelrooy is the obvious sort of striking coach to replace him. It is a little strange, like you said, the fan service element of it is a little strange, because I think, monkey see, monkey do is the best example is Roy Keane of being a manager whose biggest failing was, you would have thought his biggest quality is that he can inspire people to do things that they're incapable of doing otherwise without that kind of inspiration. That's what he did on the pitch. However, translated into management, his biggest failing was that he was frustrated that they couldn't do the things that he wanted them to do. Van Nistelrooy, I wonder, we don't know because we've not seen it in action. Will it have an impact? Will it make can you teach that kind of thing? You can't teach wizardry with some players, so can you? I know striking's a different kind of thing. There's an art, there's a science to that, so hopefully he can. And we've got players who need that, so certainly. And look, fan element of it, I love Ruud van Nistelrooy. He's one of my favourite players of all time, and from that era of time, because we weren't, by today's standards, yes, massively successful, but he only had one league title in 5 years at the club, so it's a period of time which is associated with relative underachievement. It's great to have him back. The go-ahead coach, whose name I'm not going to attempt to pronounce, but you did a sterling job at it, I'm sure. I do find it interesting that they're both Dutch, that they're from the Dutch league, because you would think that's a bigger investment in Ten Hag. You know what I mean? It's an indication of a long-term sort of stability, but that in a weird way, and I don't know why I'm saying this. I don't know if it's just the pessimistic side of me, because I still feel like Ten Hag's bought himself a stay of execution, and I know that that's going to come with a new contract. But I still feel like we've got a storm that we're not quite out of, and maybe this big investment of giving him all this stuff, which they're obviously for him, and I like that. I like the intention of that. I just worry a little bit if, like, in 3 months' time, if it doesn't go well, will we be making a big changeover again?
Well, I mean, I think there's the obvious point there. As soon as United lose, we're back into crisis mode, just because of last season's 19 defeats. You know, a lot of last season, we could point to the season before and they say, hey, look at the progress. Now, as soon as United lose a game, and it might come on the opening day of the season. In fact, there's some tough games in those first 6. Could easily lose a few. We're going to go, look at last season. That's a disaster. Are we going to have that again? So he'll be under immediate pressure, no matter the new contract and the stability that the new management team are trying to create. So I had the immediate mischievous thought with Ruud and Hake coming in. And Hake has got a much longer coaching career. Ruud's really only got 2 seasons as a coach.
Yeah.
And despite being our age, you know, he's he took a long time out of the game. So I had this mischievous thought that, well, you know, you've got Ruud, who's then interim head coach in waiting. Basically, he just slot him in. I mean, he's like, I'm not saying he's got the same career as Ten Hag or anything like that, but he has coached a Dutch first division team, like, as head coach, right? So if you need to, you can go that guy for the rest of the season. So I didn't half have that thought. And of course, Ten Hag has not signed that new contract yet. And I bet there will be some kind of clause that says, you know, you finish outside the Champions League places, it's this much, because the price to sack Ten Hag and the coaching team, it seemed like he didn't have that clause last season. Otherwise, it would have been quite an easy decision to make when all was going to shit. So we'll see. I just look. I kind of feel we don't know exactly what these guys will bring, do we? But changing the thought process, I do not think that is going to harm United. You know, Ten Hag picked the wrong plan B last season when the players were injured and he couldn't play the way he wanted to play. They played this chaos ball and he doubled down on it. Until the last 3 games of the season, when I just ran off the thought. He, you know, they went to a much more cautious, reactionary or counter-attacking approach the last 3 games of the season, and it works in one United Cup final. Took him way too long to change it up again. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, I agree with the conclusion there. I'm not so sure. He said that it backfired, the plan B that he chose, and I'll give you a theory for why I think that that's the case. You look at it on a the way that it played out and the fact that it was obvious regression, right? I'm not arguing that much is evidence in the conjecture of how bad some of those performances were, how historically bad they were in terms of United's entire history, and secondly, certainly in the last decade, we were talking equivalence. We weren't saying that it's much better, that those performances were better. We were saying that these are some of the worst. So I'm not arguing that point. But the point I did make maybe 2 or 3 times throughout the season was they never felt as bad as things got. Maybe the Palace game had a hint of it, but it never really felt that the players weren't playing for Ten Hag.
I agree.
And I felt that some of the results that we got were a consequence of an investment of faith from the squad into the manager. Like the Forest result, the way that the cup run materialised, and you got the Diallo winner, and even the sort of strength of character to not completely throw the towel in against Coventry, because as soon as it went to 3-3 and they got away with it in it was extra time, wasn't it, where they got away with the thing. So, but they got away with all of that and they still came away
the worst worst way to win a semi-final, and they still came through it. And then there was those last couple of games of the season, which they kind of turned it around a little bit. Then obviously the final did that. And I'm just going to go back, not because everything is historically should be compared to the trajectory of the Ferguson early period, but there was. I feel like this is important for anyone who's worried a little bit about the bumps. Because we said this at the start of last season, by the way, when we started on this podcast, and the injuries came in against Arsenal. I think it was. I was saying, look, get ready, because these are going to be some wild bumps in these next few months. And we saw them, and he said about whether or not you can ride it out. And he did, just however long you can manage to, like you quite rightly said, first day of the season, if we lose, pressure's most definitely back on to the point of, is it breaking point? However, if you go back to, and at the Ferguson point, again, it's not because it's successful, it's because it's the obvious frame of reference that the most obvious one that I can bring you, because there's an in point and an out point where there's a successful resolution to it. Ferguson brought in the players, and there was a period where you thought he was going to get sacked. There was a period where, obviously, we finished second in his first full season, and then there were the bumps after that as he started with the transition. Then there were the low points. Then there was the cup run in 1990, which this cup run bore a lot of similarities with. And then in that period of time, you had performances that were not good in quality, but they were good in character. And the thing that we've questioned most about this squad in the last decade is character, because we know a lot of those players have got the quality. I'm not saying this alone is a strong enough reason to say this investment is the right one and everything's going in the right direction. But if you've got the character right, and we know that some of the other elements were against him, like the injuries, and we know that the quality is there, and if we bring in a few more players and there's more quality there, I feel like that was worth all of those bumps in the last year or so. So where you say it's a bad plan B, and I can't argue on results, and I can't even argue with conviction on a long-term, like projection. I'm not definitely saying that this is the case. I'm just saying from that, I think there could be something. There could be something tangible that says this is actually more worthwhile. It was more worthwhile navigating that than anything that we've been through in that decade. Because if you've got that and it's right, then so much else can fall into place. Anyway, that's just the point I wanted to make with that.
Yeah, look, I think it's a fair point. This squad did not down tools. I know that's a really kind of reductive term. He lost the dressing room or whatever. But they did not do that. And there have definitely been times under, say, Ollie at the end, although I think we know where the poison was there, and Mourinho, where that was definitely the case, and it wasn't under Ten Hag. So, to some extent, and especially given, there's some prominent younger players came into the squad, they owe Ten Hag a chance, don't they? I feel like most of the players are on board with him. Now, I hear behind the scenes there are a few that are not, and I would not be surprised if those few that are not heading out the door. Right, clean house, fresh start. Got to be. The criticism is not of the character Ten Hag was able to build, despite him being a personality-less accountant or a technocrat. It's more that he made the wrong coaching choices. He doubled down on things that were wrong. He couldn't find an alternative that didn't involve United losing constantly. And so those are the totally valid criticisms, and we're going to look at that going forward, even with a new coaching team in place. And to kind of come full circle on this conversation, it's that new coaching team have got to be stronger going, hey, mate, this is not working. And which apparently is what McLaren and Van der Gaag did at the end of the season. They said, hey, isn't it about time we tried plan C? And that was Arsenal, Newcastle, Brighton, and the City Cup game. And obviously, lost to Arsenal, but were spirited in their performance, beat City, and lost to Brighton. That was a real mess. But beat City, right? They tried to plan C and beat City. And that's what I want from new coaches, is to go, hey, there's something not quite working here, or here's how we're going to do it. And somehow help Ten Hag instill something we can recognise as a team. Amid the kind of chameleon that Ten Hag is, the kind of, we know, and that, like, plenty of ways to skin a cat, right? It doesn't have to be Pep, doesn't have to be Mourinho ball, doesn't have to be Allardyce ball or whatever, It doesn't have to be a single definable thing, but there's just too much chameleon ball, just constantly like tinkering and not having an identity to this team until it came to chaos ball. And that's the longest period of one sustainable type of system United had. And it was an absolute disaster. So anyway, good luck, Ruud van Nistelrooy. I am going to thoroughly enjoy that sexy bastard being on the touchline. A man who has barely aged a jot. It looks like he could still get out on the field and play. Although he does shave his, I don't know, a bit too tight. I'm not a fan of the kind of Don Johnson, Miami Vice, really tight beard. I'm pointing to myself for YouTube viewers, but obviously podcasters can't see this. I don't know. I often wear stubble and I like a bit of a messy beard, and he's got a very tight line, Ruud. I'm not sure I'm a big fan of that, but he's one sexy bastard. All right, let's move on from Ruud. Maybe not. Maybe we just talk about Ruud for the rest of the pod. Let's move on from Ruud to Dan Ashworth. We can. We'll just have a Ruud special. Maybe I'll insert some commentary right here and we can just enjoy that for a few minutes. Dan Ashworth, United have reportedly agreed a fee with Newcastle for Dan Ashworth. There were a lot of people who had some level of insider knowledge that said the likelihood of this happening on PSL deadline was quite high. Newcastle very, very clearly were 75 million short on PSR and be looking at quite a large points deduction, 5, 8, something like that. And so I don't think we know the fee they've agreed for Ashworth, but let's just say it's somewhere between the 20 million that Newcastle wanted and the 2 million that United were offering. So they've come to something on PSR deadline day, and he's finally going to be joining. And he will have overall responsibility for the football side of United, reporting into Omar Barada. And under him will be Wilcox, new technical director, manager and coaching staff, recruitment staff, and medical, I believe. So they'll have, umbrella role. He's not the guy with a list of transfers he's going to start ringing up people, but he's got the, responsibility for the full structure of the football side of the business, which we've long wanted, and he's got a better record than John Murtagh in very different scenarios, but with England, then with Brighton, and then for a short period of time with Newcastle. And whatever he brings, it's exactly what Ratcliffe said they were going to do. They were going to fix the structure around the coach and allow the coach to be successful. And now this has completed the picture, I think.
Yeah, theoretically best in class. It was the other name is Paul Mitchell, who's been mentioned over years. But Dan Ashworth, certainly the track record, you can't argue with it, particularly at Brighton, which I think is what most people would say where he's had his greatest success. And I think Brighton, in his departure, you could say that, I mean, they've still carried on the same old structure, but maybe more recently, as the sort of influence of his work wanes, you would say the power of Brighton's stability looks like it's waning, or the power of that system which he affected. He's a best-in-class appointment. I think, United haven't had that kind of, Murtagh was there, but it was never really fully defined whether or not it was just Woodward's mate or, what actually he was doing in there. But Ashworth is one of those names that people have been crying out for 3 or 4 years, and United have just gone, all right, we'll just get him like we got Barada. Just like, just literally went for the two best people for the jobs in which are there. I'm glad that it's sorted now. I think the Mirror were reporting there was somewhere in the region of 10 million. Negligible in the long term of things if he's going to have the impact that he had at Brighton. How that translates on a footballing side is clear to see at Brighton, less clear to see at Newcastle. Like I said, he's not really got
Well, Eddie Howe was
hands in.
resistant to having input on the transfer side of things, apparently. So we'll see. We'll see whether. I mean, like, I think I've said this before. If Ten Hag wasn't prepared to be malleable on transfer business, we're going to talk a little bit about whether that is true or not in a second. I think. I don't think he'd be in the job if he was like, no, I need full control. I need my veto. I'm not accepting like other input. It has to be my way or the highway. I don't think he'd be in the job. Like, they've clearly defined that they want a structure in which to best support the manager. That means the manager will be one voice amongst a committee of people, basically. Now, I think, and that structure that Ashworth put into place at Brighton. I mean, they had a tough season last season. But they did sell their two best midfielders. You know, you can't keep like Southampton before them, and Brighton fans would not like the comparison. You can't keep selling your best players every year and it not have an impact. I mean, the magic will wear off in that you cannot replace them with someone who's just better every single time, you know? And it looked for a while that Brighton were doing that. They could just, like, it seemed like every week some new, like, South American kid would appear in the Brighton team and be absolutely fabulous. And you're like, what the hell? You know, they're just pulling rabbits out of hats constantly. And so you get one failure and suddenly you're weaker. And they were definitely weaker in central midfield last season. And it meant they were, well, the ignominy for a Brighton fan of finishing below Crystal Palace. But I don't know that I'm going full Richard Keys here and going, yeah, they're going to get relegated now. I feel like they will do the right kind of business to be like where they should be for a size of Brighton's club. They'd be club of Brighton size, which is sort of mid-table.
Exactly. Well, historically lower than that. So
they're way lower than that, but yeah.
So punching above their average. And they still, they had moments last season. Obviously, their performance at Old Trafford was outstanding. Some of those players we just mentioned, the individuals that they've got, you would take 3 or 4 of them in the United squad without a problem. Based on the performances for Brighton, obviously some players have moved elsewhere. Notably, most of them went to Chelsea, and you think it's a mixed bunch. But on their early season form, at least, you would have thought, yeah, we'll take 3 or 4 of them in United. Now, all right, it tailed off a little bit. Obviously, whatever was happening with De Zerbi ran cold a little bit. He's left. You wonder if they can go again with the same kind of recruitment, with the same kind of with the new man, and everything moves in the right direction. They've got, who's the manager that they brought in?
He's the former St. Pauli manager, so he got St. Pauli promoted from Bundesliga 2 last season. He's super young, but the style is the same, right? They're gonna bait the press, build out high press at the front. I mean, it's like every modern football hipster cliche rolled into one, and of course it's massively risky because he's
the
he's younger than some of the players. Pascal Gross in central midfield's older than the manager, and he's not even that old.
I remember Gross scoring goals for us against when he played for Huddersfield, and even then it was like, what's going on? But he always loves a goal against us, Gross. It is quite gross, actually, that he keeps doing it.
Yeah.
Bad pun. Anyway, the point I was making about Brighton was they a fabulous footballing team, and for most of last season, apart from maybe February onwards, I sort of lessened my opinion on it, softened my stance. I felt that they were probably the best team to watch in the league. If you asked me if I didn't want to watch United, to be fair, sometime last season, I did not, but we put ourselves through it. But if you'd asked me to watch a neutral team and make a choice, it would have been Brighton for most of last season. So the overriding point there is that I still feel that was the benefit of Ashworth's structure. However tangible that is, we don't know. I guess we'll find out firsthand. There are not a lot of Newcastle fans who were unwilling to lose him, but I still don't feel like the proper influence that we saw at Newcastle. And I feel like, obviously, is posturing from the Newcastle fans who were just unhappy that they were losing him to United. Entire nonsense of, and we're as guilty of it as anyone. But not so, I understand if a club's unwilling to play ball because we're not going to pay a transfer fee or we can't pay a transfer fee. Every club has been in that for so long, but Newcastle is this like new rich club, so unhappy that a club can come and take what's theirs, and how unhappy they were about it, and talking about money and everything. It was so rich, everything because they've been so desperate to see their club do what City have done. So seeing them struggle to be able to do that has been fun. Anyway, I think it's a good appointment.
Well, just on that point, just on that point, on Newcastle fans. Sorry, interrupted because I couldn't help myself. But yeah, like they are desperate. They've sold their soul very, very quickly. Newcastle fans, because they're desperate to they've had historically fantastic crowds, big club, and zero success. Right. And Newcastle fans for decades have turned out at St. James's Park and seen absolute crap and a load of crappy owners over and over again. And, I don't normally wish that on other supporters, but these gits maybe. No. So I'm not surprised they were ripe for state takeover. I mean, they're the perfect model, basically. Take a team that's not doing so well. You've then got an army of supporters and they turned out that way and they will argue like, even though they know it's wrong, they will argue and argue and argue, right? And it's a horrendous regime that has taken over that club, and they've done it entirely for soft power, hard power, and reputation washing, and the glory of MBS and all of that kind of stuff that I guess we don't need to relitigate. So I'm not surprised the fans bought into it. I do think the immediate sense of entitlement is kind of weird, right? This is despite 50,000 people turning up at St. James's Park for the last 50 years. They've had zero success, right? They are not one of the big clubs. Like, they're just not. And, so the entitlement, like football has a hierarchy. It just does, right? The richer clubs take players and now directors of football from the smaller clubs because, people who think they've got some talent gravitate to the place where that talent can fulfill itself the most, and also the money's there, right? So this has always happened in football, will always happen in football, and Newcastle fans are like complaining about the cartel, quote unquote, because they think the Premier League are in cahoots with the larger clubs to keep them out and keep them away from the success they're entitled to buy. And I find all this a very, very, very strange argument. But they are the perfect vehicle to make that argument.
They're also to navigate into the next section of the pod, which I'm sure was in your notes. They're also one of the clubs who are implicated in the PSR merry-go-round, which is well,
look, their revenues, Newcastle's revenues are about half of United's, less than half, in fact, and then they spent a load of money on new players last summer and the winter before that in order to accelerate their development. And they got ahead of themselves because they got into the Champions League. And I don't think anyone at Newcastle expected that kind of performance season before last. And they regressed a little bit last season. Now, of course, they had some injuries as well, but they've had to try and find a way around it. And the way they've found to get around it is to sell to their younger players. Elliot Anderson, who's gone to Forest. I think another player might have gone the other way. It looks like a bit of a PSR jiggery pokery, skullduggery, which is to sell a younger player for a very high inflated fee because you book that all that same year and same year's account. So it's booked into 23-24 because it ended on 31st of June, 30th of June, whichever. 30th, yeah. And George Minte, is it? Who's never played a game for Newcastle, but had a season on loan in Holland last year at PSV and did pretty well, apparently. So he's gone to Brighton for about the same kind of fee. Interesting to see if he's any good. I've no idea. Never seen him. So,
they rate him highly up there. I know they rate him highly, Minte. And then there's the Villa players, the two Villa players who one's gone to Chelsea.
Amari, something, whatever. Yeah, gone to Chelsea for a huge fee, never played game or played 2 games for Villa. Yeah, there's a lot of very interesting stuff. When you have to keep briefing that these are separate deals, you know they're not separate deals. I mean, it doesn't half smack of the Juventus-Barcelona Arthur Pjanic swap, for which people were investigated for fraud, because these were both they were both like rated at 60 something million, and everyone was like, what's going on here? It's clearly a swap. Now everyone's learned from that, and they've gone, well, we better do separate deals, even though there's clearly a bit of nod, wink, wink amongst a group. Yeah. I wouldn't call them a cartel, although look up the definition of cartel, and one might come to that conclusion. They clearly had a little conversation under the table, said, well, wouldn't it help our PSR position? Because Villa in a lot of trouble, Newcastle in a lot of trouble, Forest in a lot of trouble, Everton in a lot of trouble, and Chelsea in a lot of trouble. Who are the clubs transferring players between themselves?
Yeah.
Very interesting.
Exactly. And I think we were talking about this just before we started, and also it's interesting we're having a big theme of what we were just talking about is the players not giving up on managers, and that's been such a issue with United over the last decade, this kind of endemic thing of trying to get them to invest themselves into the club and sort of like realize that every game is important. And Ten Hag managed that in his first season by playing the same team all the time, and it really ramped up the importance of it. And then last season you thought, oh, the pennies dropped, and the connection with the fans, even though things are difficult, there's some big moments in there. Now, how can you foster that kind of, or how can you blame players? Because this, I guess every generation has it, because the money's exponentially grown throughout the generations, where every generation of old fuddy-duddies sat on the old wireless, what it was, and then it became, the talk shows, and then it became the podcasts, and we all sit here going, oh, the players are mercenaries, blah, blah, blah. But how you can't blame them when what's happening now is so disrespectful to those players, because you're well telling 18-year-olds uproot your entire life and move for the purpose of us being able to navigate. Your career means nothing to us because we need to circumvent some financial loopholes right now. I think that's disgusting. I really do.
Yeah. Well, it's when Roy Keane said players are just pieces of meat, and it doesn't half make it feel like they're just assets to be sold, bought and sold. Yeah. There is an argument going around, and it particularly comes from Newcastle fans that, or Newcastle supporting media. I've seen this a lot, and I completely reject this argument, which is, hey, look how bad these PSR rules are, because they're forcing clubs to sell young players who might otherwise be on a development path into the first team in order to meet these deadlines. No. It's totally the wrong way around. Newcastle chose to buy Harvey Elliott and other players last summer.
Harvey Barnes.
Harvey Barnes, sorry, not Harvey Elliott. Very different. Harvey Barnes last summer. And they chose that ahead of keeping 2 young players who they could have instead promoted into first team positions. They chose that. And this is not, PSR rules forcing them to make these choices. That's what they chose. They chose incomings over outgoings. Now, it is unfortunate that the way you book profit in accounting terms on an asset that has a 0 book value. Now, this is not to do with PSR necessarily. It's to do with these players their contract has an asset value, and the profit they're able to book goes into the accounts, right? So if United sell a player for 50 million who had a 5-year contract, and they're 3 years into the contract, the book value is going to be 20 million, right? So they sold the player for 50 million, 20 million book value, 30 million profit. Like very basic accounting. And so if you sell a player for 35 million in Yankuba Minte, or 30 whatever million for Elliot Anderson, the book value is 0, so everything is profit. Whereas if you buy a player for 50 million, You amortize that over the length of the contract, typically 5 years or at maximum of 5 years now. So you pay out 10 million a year. So this jiggery pokery, they haven't magicked up money. Like, they've just kicked the can down the road. And in some cases, especially with Villa, there is a material uplift in their incremental PSR cost, player amortization cost each year. But they've said, well, right now our need is greater than the next 5 years in which we're going to realize that that incremental amortization cost. And so there's an unfortunate outcome, which was one of those kind of unforeseen outcomes, that young academy players have a particular value when you're right up against the limit of the PSR. And I'm quite sure that if United had some young academy players to sell, if we didn't have a reputation amongst football clubs generally of not having very good young players, that United would be doing it. Now, in 2 years' time, when all those Premier League under-18 players are going through the under-23s, maybe having some successful loans or some time in the first team, they'll have a much bigger value. And maybe United will look at that as a fourth source of income. We haven't done that successfully. Historically, City and Chelsea have done. And now Aston Villa and Newcastle, and maybe Everton, if they can get away with it somewhere, are looking at young players as a source of, balancing the value on the books. And it's kind of unfortunate, but I don't think it can change.
No, a conversation that we've had, and it might have been as far as 18 months ago, United have historically, and what they've always done with the younger players and players with longer service, is they have let them go for smaller fees because it's a reward for service. And the fact that there was always I don't know what it is now, I'm not going to pretend, I think it's somewhere closer to the middle, but there was always a massive disparity. Like, the younger players, the homegrown players, were always paid relative peanuts to the players who were brought in. I know that in recent years, when with players getting agents and things like that, it's become a lot closer, so it's not really the case now. But historically, there was always that case of they rewarded that by letting them go cheaply and helping them find places. But obviously, I mean, there's nothing against using that as a business model, because historically, again, just to go to the incorporation of that, why the youth team was incorporated in the first place was A, to bring players into the first team, but B, to raise funds. That was the mandate of what the youth team was for. So if part of this modern acceptance of it is to do it in a way that raises funds, in, like you just said, for the book value, then fair enough. But I think it's the shamelessness of what they've done this summer to circumvent rules, which is not putting the players' welfare first and foremost. Not that that's the thing. I just think it's disgusting, that part of it. And if United, if they do that in terms of it's part of moving forward, and we start seeking bigger prices for players, then fair enough. But if it's done in the way that it's done this summer, it'll leave a very bad taste if they get caught up in that.
I agree. I think there's nothing wrong with running an academy to say, ultimately, first job, and Nick Cox says this very eloquently, first job is to try and find a pathway for these players into the first team, right? That's job number one. Success of the team, great. It was very nice the under-18s won Premier League North and the playoff and the cup last season. But if none of these players make the first team, that's a bit of a failure, right? Second job is to make sure these players have a good career. So that's, teach them the right way. And if they can't have a career at United, they have a career elsewhere. And there's a kind of duty of care there to these players. And United have always thought about that, I think. Even in the years where it felt like there was an underinvestment during the sort of middle block of the Glazer era, felt like there was an underinvestment in that academy. Now that's been corrected. They've got a good structure there. There's good players coming through. So these players will go on hopefully to good careers, hopefully at United, if not elsewhere. Now, the third thing is to say it could be a source of revenue. And Chelsea and City have done this very well. When City are selling, say, James Trafford for £15 million plus add-ons last season, and he never played a minute of football for City, that allows them to buy, in PSR terms, a £75 million player, right? So And the fact they're able to do that basically every season, and Chelsea have done the same thing with their academy, gives them an advantage. So it would be stupid of United to not think about that as a source of income, right? So you want to be able to think about like development of players so they're good players. Now, hopefully they get into the first team because like Alejandro Garnacho costs 250,000. What's his value in the transfer market now? 100 million, right? So that is a massive bonus for United. If a player becomes a 30 million pound player, 20, 15, 20, 30 million pound player, but they're not quite good enough for United, and United have like historically kept them hanging around for a long time, maybe it's better to sell them. Not on June the 30th to book some profit because you're going to miss the PSR deadline and force this kid to uproot. But hey, kid, we think you're a good player, just not quite good enough for United or not quite ready right now. Instead of you waiting around for 3 years and maybe never making it, you go to club X and we can make some money at the same time. Right. So I think that's a perfectly fair model, and United would be kind of foolish not to think about it because it makes a big difference.
Yeah.
All right. We got a couple other topics to talk about before we go. Transfer season is upon us. There's a lot of talk that United are discussing Matthias de Ligt with Bayern Munich. I have to say, this gave me the heebie-jeebies of it. This one, there's some PTSD, isn't there? By buying players from Bayern. It's, I think I said before we started, Fergie used to say, if it's Italians, if Italians tell me it's pasta, I look under the sauce. If Bayern are selling you a player, check out his injury record, because Owen Hargreaves was very much broken, and to a slightly lesser extent was Bastian Schweinsteiger. If they're so keen to sell him, why? And you look into his injury record, he's had a lot of small injuries and then a couple of serious ones last season with a knee injury. Doesn't half give me pause for thought. And the other two pauses for thought, and I'll let you react to, are he's Dutch and used to play for Erik ten Hag. And I don't think those two criteria are necessarily successful criteria for a successful player. Yeah. But he's young and he was very, very good at 20.
Yeah. 24 now. I like you. I put a tweet out to that effect. And I was like, well, his injuries aren't all knee related. I'm like, yeah, I know, but I'm treading the same path as you, especially when Bayern are being reasonable. That's the time to be really suspicious. Like, oh, you're going to do a fair deal, are you? Because on the face of it, de Ligt for 50 million euros seems like a really good deal. Because first of all, he's got a good reputation. Second of all, he's got a good sort of pedigree of where he's been. But then you say Bayern didn't win the league, even though you're 16 games, it was reduced to last season. Juventus makes success with him in the team. Is he going to be the kind of class that's required to replace Varane? Possibly, but you are really, if all the rumours are true, you are really investing a lot on the hope that that knee problem was a one-off and that it's not going to be part of a recurring thing. You're going to need to get the hammer out and give it a tap just to make sure. There are other things like there are question marks about his pace, and some people I have heard worries about his one-footedness, and I will worry about what if he is.
I think those two are both fair criticisms, especially the pace.
So what if he turns out to be durable, but the most durable centre backs we end up with are de Ligt and Maguire. Neither of them with a great turn. Neither of them with a great turn of pace. I don't know. But the one thing I will say is he's not as slow as Maguire. He's got all the other attributes. I think I was talking about this on this pod. We were talking about John Terry when you were having some fun at John Terry's expense, and I actually gave a mini tribute to him about how good he was as a defender. I think de Ligt has got the capability to have that kind of rigidness about him. So to not let the pace expose him in the same way that it sometimes exposes Maguire.
He's very good on the ball, which is something that Maguire doesn't have. So there are the things in there if the elements are right. But for me, it doesn't matter if you strike a good deal for him. If it's a free transfer, if it's 10 million euros or if it's 80 million euros, it's worse if it's 80 million euros, obviously. But it doesn't matter if you strike a good deal for him if he's only available for 15 games. Because like we saw with Varane, particularly last season, you're like, oh, this is great when it works. But then you're left thinking it's not working 70% of the time. And
he has missed since he started playing in the first team at Ajax, he's missed 67 games. I counted them up. So it's not Luke Shaw levels of injury or Varane levels of injury. And
of course,
like consistent, like it's only last season he missed a lot of games, really. Yeah. Prior to that, it's just a lot of small injuries, which is still concerning, but like not absolutely chronic, but it's a lot. Like if you look at Bruno's injury record, it's almost none. And this player has had consistently a couple of small injuries per season. Last season was more serious, and obviously they will tap his knee, as you say. It's amazing they still do that. Like they've got these multi-million-dollar. I just had a bunch of MRIs, right, and fancy X-ray stuff, and like all of this kind of stuff. And then when I went to have my assessment of the MRI, and they showed me all the 3D pictures of my spine and stuff, she still tapped my knee with a hammer. I'm like, what?
Yeah, they do remind me my kneecap like crumbled into dust, so they won't be doing that again.
Right. Yeah, just slot the replacement in right there. Yeah. So amazing that they will do that as part of the medical. Anyway, I'm sure a thorough medical assessment to make sure that he's this was a one-off last season. He's going to be generally available. Yeah, the lack of pace is a bit of concern. I actually think that Kim Min-jae, who went from Napoli to Bayern Munich and had a mediocre season last season, is a better profile. But who knows whether they're willing to sell him. He would command a high fee because obviously 1 year into a 5-year contract and 50 million euro fee and all of that kind of stuff. So, I'm not sure the profile is exactly perfect because if you look at where they've gone, Branthwaite, Everton not playing ball over the fee, Jean-Claire Todibo, UEFA being Gits and not allowing a transfer, and United apparently haven't explored a way of like moving him around a group of clubs. To De Ligt, who doesn't feel like the same profile of player to me as those two. So, I really wouldn't be surprised if they bring him in. He's not the one of the right-sided centre-backs, and then they bring in a left-footed player because obviously Martinez's injury record is pretty patchy, and we really need another one of those. Yeah. So, more to be heard. Clearly, United did not have a PSR problem because we were not desperately trying to sell off players on the last day of the accounting window. And now we go into a fresh year. 21-22 has dropped off the books. That was a particularly expensive year, that one. And so 22, 23, 23, 24, 24, 25 is the cycle. Despite United sort of putting it out there generally that we have no money, you look at the accounting and you go, actually, there should be a decent amount, especially if they can sell Mason Greenwood. Because as we've just discussed, that'll all be booked as pure profit. Jadon Sancho will not. Whatever they sell him for, he's going to be about on the accounting terms, I suspect, given the really high fee. But if they can sell a few players, maybe Lindelof goes as well. Maguire maybe doesn't, maybe does. I suspect they're bending towards keeping him for his final year of his contract, or +1 if they need to. Interesting balance of stuff. But I think United have got some money to spend despite telling everyone they're broke.
Better to be in that position than walking up to clubs with 3 bags full. Do you know what I mean? It's better to play the hedging the bets game. And to be fair, just to close on the De Ligt point, if you did propose those 3 names to me, I would have said, all right, maybe not the same profile as each other, but if he's fit, obviously, he's by far the best option there. So and we need a player in that area. So
Most certainly. All right. I think a lot more to come in the weeks ahead on United. I expect quite a lot of activity. So before we head out, the women's team, we talked the other day, didn't we not? Was I talking to you or Tom?
Isabel,
about Isabel. Anyway, it's been an ongoing conversation about the women's team. And unfortunately, there's been very little, there's been zero incoming activity so far, although some speculation, a little bit of outgoings, including a high profile one, and no structure really. Skinner got a new contract. There is no director of football in charge of the women's team. Polly Bancroft left. They haven't replaced her, not formally and fully. Ratcliffe basically gave a TBD in his interview with Bloomberg, which I thought was pretty disrespectful. He's given off that vibe all along, really, called them the ladies at one point, and it's a little bit old man going, oh, ladies play football too, do they? I hope, and then they kick the women's team out of the building at Carrington while work is undergoing to upgrade the men's facilities. And so it's giving off a really bad vibe. I asked around a few people what was going on there. So there's some of that. There's just, they haven't got to thinking of the structure yet. Skinner's a kind of interim, but Skinner is roundly hated amongst the players. And I've confirmed this with a few people now, and I think this is basically the view that, and he's not liked amongst the fans either, I have to say, unsurprising, given he's fairly acerbic, and United's women's team went backwards last season. So there's a lot of feels kind of chaotic, feels underthought through. And then you've got you've got Lucia Garcia, who was well liked, even if she was sort of in and out of the team, leaving. You've got Katie Zellum, the club captain, who's been there since, OG, since United were reformed, 5 seasons at the club. Very well liked as well. She's leaving. And then the big one, Mary Earps, no surprise, really. I think we thought this all along. She's gone on free transfer to PSG. And she said, quite pointedly, it's a period of transition. And at the stage of my career, I don't feel like I can stay. It's not good, is it? Any of this? Have you got any room for optimism?
It's difficult to see. The things with Ratcliffe, terminology aside, because he's an old guy getting on, I think it's disappointing that there wasn't the structure that has been put in place. While I understand it, because obviously the pressing need from a commercial aspect, and the face of the club is the men's team, I understand the theoretical explanation behind it. I would have thought that if you were taking control of the football operations of a football club and you were making that investment and you had plenty of time to work at it, that you would have thought about putting a structure in place for the women's side and not feeling like it's an afterthought. That's disappointing. And so the people who follow the women's team more stringently than what I do would have every right to feel very disappointed with that. We talked last year about the club being in a similar position in terms of what their investment would be, and losing Russo, and how disappointing that was after the Euros and the success and everything like that. And felt like United it feels like they're operating the women's side of the game, because I think the men's team, whatever the turmoil, the men's team is the men's team, and United have got the reputation, and it's so strong and sort of bulletproof in terms of it's resistant to a lot of things. Whereas the women's side of the club feels like it's willingly 1 or 2 years behind everyone else, always, and never it never feels like there's the impetus to play catch up. And I'm not going to say a lot on this one, Ed, because firstly, I don't think I'm massively qualified to do so. But my thought on this is, Earps was inevitable, right? I feel like it was inevitable, not inevitable in an acceptable way, because I think we, as fans, even casual fans of the women's side, you want to see that there'll be a turnaround, that this will be the year. You hope that they'll be building to that moment where this is the year where the investment will come in, where they will be competing,
and not be that team that loses its best players to rivals. But you can understand the Earps one because, like you say, it's a transitional period. No matter what, it would be a transitional period. So Earps is kind of like, well, I'm at that moment where I can't afford for that gamble, so I'm going to move to somewhere where it can be more established. The other things, the really disappointing one for me is Katie Zellum leaving, and I'll tell you why. Because we've just won the FA Cup through a Manchester-born girl scoring an incredible goal, and it's such a culturally defining moment, and it could be such a culturally defining landmark jumping off point for United to invent themselves as a football club in very much the form of the men's team. So they're adopting all the same characteristics moving forward. So to lose the captain who has been there since she was a girl, like, and you're not even doing that right after you've lost Russo, who's been so identifiable. Like, first of all, she was a usually marketable asset anyway, but to make mistakes like that where you're losing those kind of players, all right, the direction and Skinner. I think those kind of things, as disappointing as they are football problems. So you're always going to have a problem with manager and players and all that sort of stuff. But the kind of structural issues that lead to losing players like that, they set the club back from, instead of moving, not even keeping the club on an even keel. And that's the disappointing thing.
And I don't think it was inevitable, Wayne. I just don't think it was inevitable. I mean, that period of transition, I don't see why. Like, the women's team is so... Women's football is at a state, there's a bit more money in the game, but it's not so much money that you can't have a really sizable impact on your quality of your team within the accounting rules. And there is a hard cap in the women's game. But within those rules, you can have quite a sizable impact. You can say, hey, that new Snapdragon sponsorship, Qualcomm sponsorship, a proportion of that is for the women's team. And we're saying it's this proportion. There are plenty of ways to boost that revenue. In fact, United's revenue is pretty good on the women's side. It's 5.2 million, I think, in the last accounts. And so there are ways to go, hey, this is not an afterthought. They could have hired a director of football. They could have had someone looking for that, even if it was an exec recruitment firm. Okay, you're now the general manager. Here's your budget. We've found ways of increasing that budget. Make sure you keep your best players, bring in some high quality players. We're going to compete. Right. And it's like, it's just morally right. So when I get quite angry when people on Twitter, and they do it all the time, go, 99% of United fans don't care about the women's team. Why are you talking about that? Right. These are elite sports people. Have some fucking respect. Right. But it's just morally right to go, like, we are Manchester United. We have a men's first team. We have a women's first team. We have a men's academy, and we have a women's academy, and we're going to treat them with respect, and this is Manchester United, and we're going to try and win, right? And it was wrong that the Glazers shut down the women's team to start with, and it was wrong that they waited so long to start another one up, and it's wrong that we don't give the women's team the respect that they should have, and it's an easier lift. I keep saying this in terms of like development of that team, financially speaking, to make them extremely competitive. We shouldn't be losing players. Right, Lauren James, you can say she wanted to go to Chelsea, but we could have had an environment where she's like, I don't want to leave. Russo left because she was worried about the performance of the team. Earps has left because she's 31 and she's like, I want to win some things and I don't see this lot doing it. Katie Zellum, Lucia Garcia presumably have left just for financial reasons, right? And that's pretty worrying, right? So. I don't think any of it's good or respectful, and it doesn't have to be like this. And it's much like, I don't like lionization of executives. I like football is a bit different because that's the star power and it's the talent, and we're all here to be entertained by the footballers, and we can hero worship them. Like lionization of owners or directors, I just find it a weird modern phenomenon. So never going to do that. Not going to go, whoo, Dan Ashworth, get in and celebrate it like a goal. But at the same time, I don't think they should be exempt from criticism. And so we are glad that Jim Ratcliffe has bought part of the club. We want to move on from the Glazers. I think the plan, the strategy is the right one. We'll see if it's successful or not. But get the best in class in all these positions. create the environment where the first team manager, men's first team manager, can be as successful as possible. And they've just gone, women's team later at some point. And I just like, why? It doesn't have to be like that. So I think it's fair to point to that and go, this is an area for criticism and you should do better. Yeah. All right. Real shame, that one. And I hope it's not a permanent thing. But I think we've run through all an hour and 15 of top content. Well, an hour of top content and 15 minutes of England at the beginning. So,
yeah.
All right. Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you very much, everyone, for listening. We'll be back again sometime in the future soon, I think. And Wayne, thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you.
Pleasure, as always, to talk to you. Everyone will be back soon. Bye now.